right, so let's continue with the next part of American history, where we're going to take a look at the history of the US from the Washington administration to the War of 1812. So first of all, let me just recap what we have talked about in the Declaration of Independence, which was a statement adopted by the Second Continental Congress. It was ratified on the 4th of July, 1776. It was written by mainly Thomas Jefferson, but along with others, with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. So these three people wrote it. And if you remember, it begins with a reference to natural and legal rights of the people, and that the people have the right to get rid of the king or the ruler if the ruler doesn't respect their rights. Then there is a list of grievances against George III, like how he disrespected the rights of the American colonists, and as a result, it announced the independence of the country. And of course, we all know that it has an immense influence all over the world, and it became one of the key American texts. We're going to talk a little bit about the other key American texts today. And those of you who've already had college institutions are already familiar with it, but a little revision never hurts. So after the US became independent, the big question was, how do they organize the life of the country? So still during the War of Independence, if you remember, it only ended in 83. So in 1781, they adopted the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was the first constitution of the United States. Let's just unwrap this thing. So confederation means a loose alliance, and perpetual means forever lasting. And articles here, what they mean are legal articles. So basically, this was the first constitution of the United States, which designed a loose union that would have been lasting forever, but in reality it only lasted until 1789, until the current constitution, the Constitution of the United States, was adopted. Well, what was the Articles of Confederation government like? First of all, there were no central taxes. We can understand why this is a problem. This means that the government has very little money, and it cannot really do too much, which was a problem for a lot of people. There was also no single currency, which is a kind of like a real problem, because then they cannot really trade, or it makes it more difficult. Every state could veto the decisions, which is like a huge problem, because it was very difficult to pass anything. If even the smallest state, Rhode Island, decided to veto, then it would be able to block the whole process. States were able to regulate commerce. I think this is understandably going to be difficult to trade inside the country if every state has different rules. So basically the federal government had no real power. There was no real president, there was no judicial process, it was basically only a legislative body. Basically there was a Congress, but even here states could veto. For this reason, during these 8 years, the only significant piece of legislation that was passed was the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance regulated how a new state can be admitted, first as a territory, then if they fulfill a certain criteria of, how well organized they are, then they can become a state. They banned slavery to the north of the Ohio River and the mistreatment of Indians. Unfortunately, this was not really followed. So, because of the many problems with the Constitution, they decided to have a convention where they would propose amendments to the Constitution. Okay, so they would propose suggest changes. So on the 25th of May 1787, the convention opened in Philadelphia. There were 55 founding fathers. How many founding fathers there were depends on like how you count it, because not all of them remained for the whole process. Some of them had enough of it and just left the convention. Because why were they outraged? Well, because in secret the Constitutional Convention decided to write a new constitution. If you remember what I said a few seconds ago, they were not supposed to write a new constitution. They were supposed to just propose and suggest changes to the old one. So basically with this, they overstepped their mandate. They decided to do more than they were supposed to. Eventually, after long debates, in September, after this very like summer-long discussion, the final version of the Constitution was approved. Then they had to adopt it, and every state had to ratify it, because, I mean, look, they had to have a large degree of legitimacy, because technically speaking, the Constitution was illegitimate. So every state had to ratify it. Officially in the Constitution, it says that only 9 states has to ratify. So in June, a year later, 88, the Constitution became effective when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify, but eventually they waited until all 13 states ratified it, including the 2 big ones, New York and Virginia. And it was on the 4th of March 1789 that the first Congress, already elected under the new Constitution, convened. So what is the US Constitution like? The American Constitution is the oldest written constitution that is still in effect. There are many, many people misunderstand it. Many people think that it's the oldest constitution. It isn't. You all know that the Articles of Confederation is older than it is, because I've just talked about it. But it is the oldest written one that is still in effect. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, which means that no other law can contradict it. But it is very concise, it's short, so it can be interpreted strictly and more loosely. So it offers both the strict and the loose interpretation. Its sources are the natural law, the British common law, the Enlightenment, the separation of powers, and the social contract. So the natural law comes from the ancient Greek, and it basically is about the equality, so law rights that people get, that they were born with. Another important thing is the British common law, the traditions of Great Britain, including also the Bill of Rights. And also the Enlightenment had a big effect on it. The separation of powers by Montesquieu, and the social contract by Rousseau. The separation of powers that talks about the separation of the 3 branches of government, and the social contract that is basically says that the people have the right to pick a new government or change the government. I mean, in this case with elections. There were several compromises during the Constitution. One of them was the 3/5 compromise. This was about the counting of slaves for taxation and representation. Basically, there were certain taxes that were depending on the population of the state, and also in Congress, in the House, they decided about the number of representatives that each state gets based on their population. So the big question was, how should they count the slaves? And the eventual compromise was that 3/5 of the slave population would count when it comes to taxation as well as representation. The other compromise was the Great Compromise, which was about how states should be represented. Should they have equal representation, so every state have the same number of representatives, or should they have proportional representation, meaning that the larger states are going to have more representatives. And the Great Compromise said that there would be proportional representation in the House, in the House of Representatives, and there would be equal representation in Senate. So there are districts today in the House, and the bigger states are going to have more districts. And there is equal representation in Senate, so every state has 2 senators, no matter how big it is. And another compromise was about the ratification. So a group of founding fathers, the anti-federalists that we're going to talk about later, were not satisfied with the Constitution because they believed that it doesn't protect people's rights enough. So they demanded that the Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution, which eventually happened in 1791, 2 years after the adoption of the Constitution. The first 10 amendments were added, the first 10 amendments that protect the rights of the people. So this is how the Constitution looks like. There is a preamble, which is about the philosophical foundations and the purpose of the Constitution. Then the 7 articles. You can see that the first 3 articles are the 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judiciary. Then there is an article about interstate relations, about amendments. Then there is one about general provisions and the ratification. And there are 27 amendments up to date, and 10 of them are the Bill of Rights. So already during the Constitution, there were fierce debates between 2 groups of politicians, 2 groups of founding fathers. The first group were called the Federalists, and the other group were called the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists were supporting the Constitution. The Constitution is a Federalist document, whereas the Anti-Federalists were critical of the Constitution, even though, they didn't outright reject it, at least not most of them. The leader of the Federalists was Alexander Hamilton, about whom I'm going to talk in a few minutes. And the leader of the Anti-Federalists was Thomas Jefferson. So the Federalists wanted a bigger, stronger government. And the Anti-Federalists wanted a smaller government and then weaker. The Anti-Federalists instead supported the states' rights. And the Federalists wanted the stronger federal government and weaker states. The Federalists wanted to have a better relationship with Britain. You have to keep in mind that this is the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Whereas the Anti-Federalists wanted a stronger relationship with France, because France just helped the United States win the War of Independence, they believed. The Federalists wanted to improve the bigger cities, and most of their supporters were industrialists and merchants, whereas the Anti-Federalists were supporting independent farmers in rural areas. And the Federalists, their important document was the Federalist Papers, in which they argued for the adoption of the Constitution, whereas, of course, the most important Anti-Federalist document was the Bill of Rights. So, if you take a look at it, you have to understand that the Federalists were more popular in the big cities that wanted more government intervention and stronger trade with Britain, and a federal government that would support the rights of these bigger economic units, whereas the Anti-Federalists were supported by the small independent farmers who didn't want any big governments to just meddle in their affairs. They didn't want big taxes. All they wanted to be left alone. So let's present the leaders of the 2 political parties. The first one is Alexander Hamilton, who I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar with because of the recent musical. So, who was Hamilton? Hamilton was a politician. He was also a lawyer, a banker, a soldier, and of course a founding father, like this whole generation. He was special because he was born out of wedlock, not even in the territory that would later become the United States, but in the Caribbean. He became an orphan at a young age, but he was very smart and talented, so he was sent to study in New York. During the War of Independence, he became an aide to Washington, like a military aide. And later he served as Secretary of Treasury under Washington in his administration. He became the leader of the Federalist Party, and in spite of their differences, he helped Jefferson defeat Aaron Burr in 1800. The election of 1800 was very contested because the electoral votes were exactly the same for the two candidates. And it was actually, with Hamilton's help that Jefferson could become the president. Later, 4 years later, Burr won to be the governor of New York, and he got into a duel with Hamilton. And during this duel, Aaron Burr shot Hamilton, who later died because of his injuries the next day. So Hamilton died at a relatively young age in a duel. So I think this is an interesting life. It's not an accident that he was later made into a musical. Jefferson also had an interesting life. He was also a politician. He was a diplomat. He was a lawyer. He was, of course, another founding father. And unlike Hamilton, Jefferson was president, the third president from 1801 to 1809. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. We've discussed it, that it was not him alone who created this text, but he was the one who created the actual words. He became the leader of the Anti-Federalists, and later the Anti-Federalists were named the Democratic Republican Party, and they are the predecessors of the present-day Democratic Party. We're going to talk about the development of the political parties a little bit later, I think next week or 2 weeks from now. And he was also in Washington's cabinet as Secretary of State. So you can imagine that Washington kind of tried to create a unified government. George Washington, I don't think that we've mentioned this, but he was famous for his rejection of political parties, and he wanted to unite all the politicians and all the sides. And also, he's famous because he willingly stepped down after 2 terms. He could have been elected president as many times as he wanted to, but he said that after 2 terms that this is enough, which is understandable. But not a lot of politicians were willing to do this. Going back to Jefferson. Jefferson was, when he became president, in spite of the fact that he was very much arguing against a strong federal government, he still decided to do the Louisiana Purchase, to purchase this big patch of land from France. And so kind of, in contradiction of his principles. And the reason why he's facing most criticism today is that just like George Washington, he was a slave owner, but unlike George Washington, Jefferson had an affair with one of his slaves. This is very interesting, and if you're curious about it, we can talk about it in class. So he also founded the University of Virginia, and it's just a fun fact, or fun, that is not fun, but it's an interesting fact that he died on the 50th anniversary of independence, which is, yes, 1826, July 4, and he died at the very same time as his biggest political opponent, John Adams, although by the end of their life they kind of made peace with each other. So let's review the politics of the period from the Washington administration to the War of 1812. So first, of course, the first president was Washington, a Federalist, who served 2 terms. I've already mentioned that after 2 terms, Washington decided not to run for the 3rd time, and he was followed by another Federalist, John Adams. Adams was, like back in those days, the second biggest, the person who got the second biggest number of votes would have become the vice president. So under Adams, it was Jefferson. You can imagine that the problems that this posed. Just imagine if Trump would be the vice president of Biden, or if Hillary would have been the vice president of Trump. And after Adams, Jefferson, an anti-federalist, came to power, served 2 terms. And after him, it was Madison, another Federalist. But after a while, the anti-federalists out-federalized the Federalists. What does this mean? This exactly means what I just said in the previous slide. That whereas the anti-federalists were supposedly for smaller central government, once they were in power, they very much strengthened the power of the federal government. So, you know, it was, in many ways, they adopted the policies of the Federalists. I already talked about the 1800 election, when Jefferson and Burr got the same number of electoral votes. And there was a lot of conflict about this. And after this, 12th Amendment was adopted to solve the problem that I've just talked about. So the president and the vice president now are running on the same ticket. So when you vote for the president as well as the vice president, and you don't vote separately for them. Another important thing that happened during this period was the appearance of the judicial review. The judicial review is the right of the courts, especially the Supreme Court, to overrule unconstitutional laws. This was originally not part of the Constitution, but eventually, but it was kind of like a part of this British common law system. And the first time that the Supreme Court used this power was under Chief Justice John Marshall in the Marbury versus Madison case. This is basically like somebody was fired and went to court about it, fired from the government, and the Supreme Court decided that his firing was unconstitutional and he had to be reinstated or compensated in some way. An important aspect of this whole thing was the debt. The United States was in debt from Britain. Like the British agreed to American independence, but they demanded that the Americans repay them for a lot of the costs that they had during the French and Indian War, if you look back to the previous class. And so the US had to repay this. A common currency was established, the US dollar, and a central bank, the Bank of the United States. The Federalists were, along with the banker Hamilton, were supporting the Bank of the US. The anti-federalists were against the central bank. Well, what does the central bank do? The central bank is basically responsible for regulating the money. And then you might ask, how did money come to be if not for the central bank? Well, I mean, before the 20th century, money was just simply gold or silver. So when they decided how much a dollar was like an amount of how much gold it is, how many pounds or ounces or whatever. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's called the British pound. So the Bank of the US was regulating this, and they also introduced a lot of tariffs on trade. Basically, this was the Federalist program in money business that was realized. So in diplomacy, as I said, on the world stage, this was a time of the Napoleonic Wars. And the aim was to get out of alliances and stay out of wars. This is what Washington wanted. He warned against being allied with foreign powers, and he recommended that countries stay out of wars. In diplomacy, they made a treaty with Britain, the so-called Jay's Treaty. This is John Jay who was negotiating this. This is why it's called Jay's Treaty. And it was not very successful. So the northwestern part of the United States, so basically this Indiana, Ohio, Illinois region, was evacuated by the British because they said that they're going to have troops there until the Americans repair their debt. Well, in return for several trade agreements that were bad for the United States, they decided to leave that area and give it to the Americans back. In Spain, they managed to agree that the Mississippi between the American and the Spanish-owned territories would be an open boundary, and New Orleans would become kind of like a free city that the Americans could use. With regards to France, there was a so the US started out as a friend of France, and when the French Revolution started, first the Americans were happy about it. They were like, okay, the French are following our example, right? So they are having a revolution like us. Well, not exactly. So once had started rolling, if you remember from high school history, during the French Revolution, things went pretty bad pretty fast, and the terroristic far left of the Jacobites came to power, and the Americans tried to kind of like get out of the alliance. And there was this big scandal, the XYZ affair. These were the code names of 3 diplomats who wanted to talk to the new French government after one of the changes of government that happened pretty quickly in revolutionary France. And the problem was that they expected the French a bribe. And the Americans were outraged by this because they felt that this was dishonorable and that the French were not respecting the Americans, which is, correct. This led to cooling of relations and what they often call the quasi-war or an undeclared naval war. What does this mean? That officially the US and France were not at war, but and they didn't want to occupy each other, but basically if they saw each other on sea, they would start shooting. Added to this was the question of impressment. We're going to talk about this a little bit later as well. Impressment was a practice during the Napoleonic Wars whereby the British, and to a lesser extent the French, but especially the British, would capture American ships, forcefully claiming that the sailors were actually British deserters. I mean, there was not that much of a difference between an American and a British citizen at the time, and a lot of the Americans were actually former British citizens. So they would say that they were deserting from the British Navy, they would forcefully enlist them, and they would seize the ship. So basically they would rob the ship and kidnap the people, and this was very much against the Americans. And as you'll see, this was one of the reasons for the War of 1812. Another reason was the British involvement in the Indian affairs. So very important step, as I've already mentioned, Thomas Jefferson, during his presidency, purchased the Louisiana territory from the French. The Louisiana territory is not just the present-day Louisiana, but basically the area to the west of the Mississippi, so from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. How did the French get this? Well, if you remember, during the French and Indian War, they have lost all their territory, but Napoleon defeated Spain, so France got back all those territories that the Spanish got after the French and Indian War. And they didn't really need it. They needed the money more. So he sold it to the Americans, this way doubling the territory of the country. But a lot of the Native Americans were not happy about the westward expansion because they were living there, right? So from 1804 to 1814, there was a war with the Mississippi Indian Alliance. So Tecumseh, who was a chief of the Shawnee tribe, so the name is Tecumseh, the tribe name is Shawnee, he managed to ally the Mississippi Indian tribes into an alliance, and they were fighting pretty effectively against the Americans. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, when Tecumseh was defeated, they found out why. It was because the British were supplying them. So the British were supplying the Native Americans with weapons. And of course, this was something that the Americans didn't like at all. Obviously, the reason for this was that the British were looking at the Americans as potential enemies, and they were maybe hoping that if they get weakened by the natives, they might be able to get them back to the British Empire. So the War of 1812. What were the reasons? Impressment, Napoleonic Wars, and the Indians or natives. I've just mentioned the natives. Impressment, if you remember, is when the British kidnapped the sailors and took the ships. And also there were the Napoleonic Wars. And the Americans believed that the British were weakened. So maybe it would be possible to, get their hands on some of the British colonies in North America, which are the present-day Canada. So the Congress was very much split over this, but eventually they decided to attack. And first they had some successes in Canada. They almost captured Montreal, but they ended up leaving the central part of the country undefended. And at this time, the Americans had no serious navy. So the British managed to blockade all the ports. And they also attacked the central part of the country, and they managed to burn down Washington and bombard Baltimore. The bombardment of Baltimore is important because this is where the Star-Spangled Banner was born. After the bombing of Fort McHenry, the national anthem was written about this battle. The only place where the US was victorious really was in the South, where Andrew Jackson successfully managed to defeat the British in 1815. But the problem is that by this time the war was over. How is this possible? Well, the treaty was signed in Ghent, in Belgium, in December 1814, and they decided that they returned to the status quo, meaning that the situation as it was before the war. So the Americans didn't lose any territories, but they didn't gain any territories either. But by the time this, the news of the peace arrived to the American continent, it was, several weeks later. So in December, there was the peace, and in January, there was still one more battle, a huge victory for the Americans in New Orleans, but this didn't matter because while they didn't know about it, peace was already signed. What was the result? Britain really accepted independence. After the War of Independence, they said okay, but secretly they were in ways hoping that they might be able to regain the colonies. They gave up on this because they realized that, okay, we probably would not be able to defeat these guys so easily. And the westward expansion became possible after the defeat of the Native American allies of the British. So the Americans could expand on the other side of the Mississippi, and also national pride was swelling because a lot of Americans felt that they managed to stand up to the British. Okay, guys, all right. So thank you. Don't forget to ask the questions, and see you all in class.